For 66 years, Ramses III patrolled the borders of Egypt, crushed rebellions, raised monuments, and took more wives than the average Egyptian man took meals. He was the second longest reigning pharaoh after his father, Seti, and the subject of modern fascination with several films and documentaries made about him. But Ramses the Great is largely considered a false god among many scholars. So what did Ramses do to gain this reputation? Let's find out in today's episode, only on our channel. The boy who would become Ramses II was born in 1270. His original name was Usermatra, meaning the soul of Ra is mighty. But when he took the throne at age 25, he changed his name to Ramses, possibly after his favorite god, Ramses, whom he considered his patron deity. At least that's what most historians believe. After all, he put Ramses on everything from pieces of pottery to pieces of legislation. When he came into power, Ramses inherited an empire that stretched from the Levant in the east to the Nubian border in the south, but he wanted more. He didn't just want to rule Egypt, he wanted to be a god. Most Egyptians believed their pharaohs were divine, but Ramses took it to another level. He built himself monumental statues, some over 66 feet tall, and decorated them with the royal titles that proclaimed him as a god. For example, powerful bull, Ramses, son of the sun god, Ra, or a mighty falcon, Ramses, the king of kings. While we can debate whether Ramses truly believed he was a god, there's no denying that his impact was huge. During his reign, he oversaw a cultural revolution. The capital city was renamed Thebes to honor his favorite god, and he rebuilt the temples that his father had neglected. He also commissioned many works of art, including those depicting the wars he fought. One of the most famous is a relief that depicts the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites in modern-day Turkey. It's the world's first known war relief to depict a battle in motion, but the statue itself is more interesting because it shows Ramses next to a defeated king holding his scepter while he looks down on the fallen monarch. Now, hold on a minute. We all know that sometimes when someone loses a battle, they don't look like they lost. That's why athletes are so careful about celebrating too early. They don't want to get embarrassed if they end up losing. Well, Ramses might have had something similar in mind when he decided to call the Battle of Kadesh a win, even though nobody really won. Don't get us wrong. The battle itself was epic. Ramses assembled a massive army of around 5,000 chariots and 20,000 foot soldiers, which he led himself. On the other side of the field was the Hittite king, Muwatalli II, along with his chariots and troops. The two armies met near the Orontes River, and the fighting continued for 5 hours. According to Ramses, his archers used trick arrows to burn the Hittite chariots, and he chased the retreating army until it reached the safety of the city. But in reality, both sides had suffered heavy losses, and neither could claim a decisive victory. Nobody had bragging rights. And instead of sticking with the stalemate, Ramses went ahead and called it a win. But Ramses was not only a great liar. He was also the world's first goodwill ambassador. In 1258 BC, Ramses traveled to the Levant to meet with the king of the Hittites. While details are scarce, we know that the two leaders met face-to-face and established the world's first recorded peace treaty. Even better, it survived for almost 3,000 years and is still studied by diplomats today. Unfortunately, the peace didn't last long. The Hittites attacked again, possibly because Muwatalli II's brother and successor, Urhi-Teshub, resented the truce. The Egyptians defeated the Hittites and pushed them back to the Euphrates River. But soon the Assyrians invaded Egypt. Ramses' allies, the Syrians, were defeated and the invaders pushed all the way to Thebes. However, the Assyrians eventually retreated, possibly due to internal conflicts. And Ramses was able to reclaim his lost territories. During these times of war, Ramses found solace in building projects. For example, he completed the temple of his patron god, built a series of defensive walls around the capital, and constructed his own palace. But perhaps his greatest building achievement was Abu Simbel. The construction began under his father, Seti I, but Ramses added his personal touch to the project. which included 4 massive statues of himself, each 66 feet tall. The interior of the temple is just as impressive. If you take the width of the entire front of the temple and divide it by the length of its central nave, you'll find that it's exactly equal to pi, the mathematical constant. Speaking of math, it's important to remember that Ramses ruled Egypt for an impressive 66 years. To put that in perspective, George Washington only ruled the United States for 14 years. Abraham Lincoln, 16. And if we add the reigns of his parents, Egypt had been under the rule of the same family for over 100 years. Ramses accomplished a lot during that time. He built 40 cities, 70 fortresses, 10 temples, and appointed officials throughout Egypt to keep everything running smoothly. He also left behind a large family. During his reign, he married at least 16 women, although some historians claim he had well over 100, and he sired more than 100 children. Yeah, that's right. The man had a lot of kids. Some estimates say he had as many as 165 of them. But that number is usually discounted as exaggerated propaganda. Historians now agree that his total number of children was probably somewhere between 60 and 100. However, not all of his children lived to adulthood, and fewer still became rulers. When Ramses died, his 13th son, Merneptah, took the throne. Merneptah wasn't the oldest child, but he was the oldest surviving son. Ramses' heirs are documented in the Merneptah stele, a black granite slab that was discovered near the entrance to his son's pyramid. Speaking of pyramids, Ramses loved them. He actually built 7 of them during his reign, but none compared to the Great Pyramid of Giza. While they may be smaller, they're still impressive. His first pyramid was built near the Libyan desert, where he spent much of his early life. It's not perfectly square, but it's the tallest of all of Ramses' pyramids. The next 2 were built at the entrance to the Valley of the Kings, where many pharaohs were buried. A little closer to the capital, he built another pyramid for his beloved wife, Queen Nefertari. Next to it was a mortuary temple with some of the most stunning artwork ever seen in Egypt. The final 3 pyramids were built at the edge of the desert where Ramses hoped to be buried. He never made it. When archaeologists uncovered his tomb in 1881, it was filled with nothing but rocks and dirt. Not even his bones were inside. Turns out his successor moved his remains to another secret location. As for the tomb itself, it was spectacular. Ramses had ordered it to be dug deep into the mountainside. The entrance was protected by a false door. The burial chamber was surrounded by 6 smaller rooms, each containing a giant statue of Ramses. In the center of the room was his sarcophagus, which was made of red granite. Its lid alone weighed over 100 tons. Unfortunately, it was never finished. Most of the artwork was still under construction when Ramses died, and nobody knows why. Perhaps his son wanted him to rest in peace. Or maybe he was simply trying to save money. Regardless, we'll never know. But this is where things get weird. It's well documented that Ramses was buried in the Valley of the Kings. But how do we know that his body wasn't moved? Simple. His mummy still exists. It was discovered in 1826 in a cave near the town of Al-Kabinet, which was likely used by tomb robbers to hide their loot. Soon after, it was identified as Ramses based on the tattoos on his feet, which matched those depicted in ancient artwork. Since then, the mummy has been on display at the British Museum. It's well preserved and wrapped in gold leaf, with only a few pieces missing. In fact, the museum staff once allowed Egyptologist Zahi Hawass to unwrap a piece of linen to confirm that it was a man's mummy. As for his legacy, Ramses' name is carved into every stone he touched. He built his legacy on the idea of being immortal, and for the most part, he succeeded. Scholars argue over whether he embellished his victories or exploited the deaths of his enemies to build himself up. But no one denies his accomplishments. He built majestic temples, amazing pyramids, and a tomb that would make any pharaoh envious. Most importantly, he lasted longer than everyone else. He ruled for twice as long as the average pharaoh. His descendants' names were written down in history books. And when people think of ancient Egypt, they think of him. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Rome was falling apart. Assassins had just murdered Julius Caesar. The Republic was in chaos. Then came Augustus, Caesar's heir. Smart, patient, deadly. He didn't seize power overnight. He earned it step by step until no one could stop him. He became Rome's first emperor. Started the Pax Romana, 200 years of peace, and transformed the city of bricks into a city of marble, behind the calm, ruthless control. He crushed rivals, rewrote laws, and ruled until the day he died. They called him Augustus. But history remembers him as the man who built an empire. It's me. This is my channel, and this is the story of Augustus, Part 1, The Rise of the First Emperor. When Gaius Octavius was born, the Roman Republic was in its infancy. Rome was a small village of farmers and shepherds. Legend said that all of Italy would one day fall under its rule. But at that point, Rome wasn't even a province. It wasn't even free. It was ruled by kings from outside Italy. Octavius was born a Roman citizen, but he was a second-class citizen. That wouldn't change until his great-uncle, Julius Caesar, took power, but Caesar's rise to power also led to his downfall. When he was assassinated, Octavius was in his early 20s, and his father had just died. He inherited a noble title, but not much else. Yet almost immediately, his uncle's will named him Caesar's heir, granting him the title Caesar. At the time, that meant nothing. In fact, if Octavian wanted to claim the title, he'd have to fight for it. Rival senators were already maneuvering for power. Octavian had just returned from conquering Egypt. Cleopatra and Mark Antony were now running Rome together. Marcus Agrippa, one of Caesar's generals, was leading the opposition. Octavian didn't stand a chance, so he did what any reasonable young man would do. He made nice with the most powerful people in Rome and asked them for money. Lots of money. He married the daughter of Cleopatra and Antony, then raised an army and fought against Agrippa. It went about as well as you'd expect. Octavian lost. In fact, he lost so badly that he had to escape Rome without a single soldier to his name. Back in his villa, Octavian realized he was in trouble. His allies were abandoning him. His enemies were hunting him. His lover had just given birth to twins. He needed money, soldiers, anything to turn the tide. So he did something desperate. He marched back to Rome, broke into the temple of Janus, a god of war, and took the sacred implements inside. He declared war on Antony and Cleopatra. They'd taken his inheritance. Now he was taking theirs. That was all the excuse he needed. The Senate declared war on Antony and Cleopatra and gave Octavian command of the army. Suddenly he was rich, he was powerful, he was loved. As he marched on Antony and Cleopatra, Octavian won battle after battle. Soon he stood before the gates of Alexandria. Inside, Cleopatra waited. She may have been the most famous woman in the world, but she was desperate. Her lover, Mark Antony, had gone mad. He gambled away half of Egypt to one of Octavian's generals. If Octavian took Alexandria, Antony would have nothing left to give, so Cleopatra struck a deal. If Octavian let her keep her fortune, she'd marry him. Of course, Then they sailed to Athens where they got married. Now that Antony and Cleopatra were out of the picture, it was time for Octavian to fix Rome. He reformed the courts, reformed the treasury, even reformed the army. But there were still those who resented Caesar's rise to power, like Sextus Pompey, the son of one of Caesar's old enemies. He led a fleet of ships across the Mediterranean, pillaging on Roman shipping lanes. He was a threat to Rome, but worse, he was a threat to Octavian's power, and that couldn't stand. Octavian assembled a navy, led by Agrippa, the very general who had defeated him years earlier. They met off the coast of Mylae, and after 2 days of fighting, Pompey's fleet was destroyed. Not only was Sextus Pompey killed, but the seas were clear for trade once more. Once again, Octavian had proven himself to be a brilliant general. But now there was another threat. This time it wasn't a rival general or a foreign king. It was a civil war. Rome had expanded across the Mediterranean, but that hadn't brought more prosperity. It had brought more corruption, more poverty, more violence, and the people were tired of it. They wanted a strong leader who could restore order to their lives. But when Octavian traveled around the Republic, meeting with the people, hearing their concerns, their problems. He didn't see a divided people. He saw a divided government. The Senate wasn't to blame. The generals weren't to blame. Neither were the people. It was him. He was the problem. He spent so much time defeating his rivals, crushing his enemies, that he'd ignored the Republic. He'd become everything his uncle Julius Caesar had been before him, a distant, uncaring ruler. Octavian knew he could fix it. He just needed a better way to rule. He started with the army. Soldiers had followed him for years, through victory and defeat, but now he wanted them to follow him back to the fields. As farmers, he disbanded his legions and sent the soldiers home to plant crops, build roads and aqueducts. To rebuild the foundations of Rome, he refocused the military, making it smaller, leaner, but also giving it a permanent standing army. He paid the soldiers better, treated them better. And suddenly the Republic had an army it could count on. Next, he fixed the courts. Under Caesar, the courts had been controlled by party loyalists. Now they were run by jurists, lawyers who knew the law. He reformed the calendar, reorganized local governments, even hired architects to design new public buildings. All the while, he kept an eye on the money. Octavian understood that to be truly wealthy, a nation needed to be efficient. So he created an accounting office to collect taxes and keep track of the revenue. The result was astonishing. In 3 years, the government went from owing millions to having a $600 million surplus. Yet for all this work, Octavian still wasn't popular. People wanted a strong leader. Instead, he was an efficient manager. He was good with numbers, and not so good with people. Still, he was able to get things done, like land reform. The poor were leaving the city, abandoning their farms to grow food in the countryside. So Octavian bought up large plots of land and sold them to poor citizens. Soon they were growing wheat, vegetables, olives. Suddenly they could feed themselves and their families without going to the markets. In a few short years, Octavian went from being a hated leader to being a beloved one. But before anyone could declare him king, he left Rome. He'd fallen in love with a woman named Livia. She was beautiful, she was intelligent, and she was married. Octavian wasn't deterred. He pursued her relentlessly, wrote her poetry, courted her friends and family, until finally she agreed to leave her husband and be with him. They married, and soon they set sail for the east. There on the island of Delos, Octavian made a startling announcement. He would give up his title of Augustus and live as a private citizen. After 14 years of war, 14 years of bloodshed, he was done. Now he wanted to live a simple life. Sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? Well, fairy tales don't usually have villains. And this one had one big villain, a former ally, a former friend, Marcus Agrippa. He'd helped Octavian become powerful. Now he was trying to take that power away. He was planning to assassinate Octavian, steal his throne, and marry Octavian's widow. Luckily, Octavian caught wind of the plot, arrested Agrippa, and executed him. From there, Octavian seized even more power for himself, becoming the first emperor of Rome. He ruled the entire Mediterranean. He reformed the government, the military, the economy. He reorganized entire cities. And yet he was never satisfied. There was always more to do, more power to grab. He didn't want to be Augustus, the greatest emperor Rome had ever seen. He wanted to be Augustus, the greatest emperor Rome would ever see. Stay tuned for more stories of powerful leaders who changed the world, including the next chapter in the series, The Downfall of an Empire. See you next time. A 2Z. That's how the great empires began. Alexander the Great, Ashoka the First, Augustus Caesar. But that formula doesn't fit for China. The story of China is best described by this. One dynasty dies, another is born. We'll meet one such leader today. A man who built an empire, a new way of ruling. A leader we can call the Dragon of the Silk Road. Yes, you heard that right. Silk Road. Welcome to the show. And if you're new here, this is where history comes to life. Let me introduce you to Han Dynasty China. Imagine a world without Google Maps. You want to buy silk, you must go to the market yourself. You want to buy spices from India? You must cross deserts and mountains. That's what trade was like till 135 BC. Then came a path through deserts and mountains, oases and plains, a path that connected east to west, the longest and greatest trade route the world had ever seen. We call it the Silk Road. It still exists. Some parts are better maintained than others. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but do you know its real name? Chang'an Titiya. That's where it began, in the Chinese city of Chang'an, the capital of the Han Dynasty. From there, it ran all the way to TIA at the edge of the Mediterranean. That's a distance of over 4,600 miles. What did they trade? Everything. Spices, cotton, cloth, gold, silver, precious stones, ivory, tea, porcelain, ideas, religion, technology, culture, everything you can imagine. The Silk Road was about trade, but it was also about exchange, cultural, intellectual. It spread ideas like the Wheel of Dharma or Buddhism. It brought back Greek and Roman sculptures. It introduced spaghetti to China. In return, noodles went to Europe. Printing, paper-making, gunpowder, compass, kite, these innovations moved east to west. And this wouldn't have happened without one man, Han Wudi. He was not just a trader, he was an emperor, the third emperor of the Han Dynasty. He reigned for 54 years. So here's his story. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. Chinese historians start their timeline from 206 BC. We'll follow them. Western historians start their timeline from 753 BC. There's a difference of 981 years. Our story begins in 141 BC. The Xiongnu were a nomadic tribe living beyond the northern borders of the Han Empire. For decades, they raided Chinese settlements, so Emperor Wu decided to do something about it. He raised an army, attacked the Xiongnu, defeated them, and pushed them back. This victory expanded his empire. It gave him land, riches, resources, but also a headache. These lands were far from the capital, hard to rule. So Emperor Wu divided the empire into provinces and appointed officials to collect taxes and maintain law and order. But that was not enough. He wanted more. The problem was not just administration. The bigger problem was defense. The Huns were a threat, but so were the Xiongnu. So were the Kong and the Dingling and the Taiju, all nomadic tribes living north of the Han Empire. They raided border towns. They kidnapped people for ransom, and Emperor Wu was tired of it. So he set out to finish the job his father started. Once again, he raised an army. He marched north. He fought long and hard battles against the Xiongnu, the Kang, the Zhongar, and the Taijut. Finally, he defeated them, chased them away from the borders. That's when he got his reward, the title of the martial emperor. He returned to the capital and found a new problem. People did not pay taxes. Agriculture had collapsed. China was on the brink of ruin. What could he do? Two options were in front of him. Option no. 1. Conquer new lands. Option no. 2. Open up to foreign lands. What does history say? It says he chose option no. 2. He opened up the Silk Road to Central Asia, to the west. And here's what happened next. Gold flooded the empire. The king of the western regions had lots of it. He gave some to the Chinese, kept some for himself, and soon the entire empire was rich. How did he change China? Well, first, he standardized weights and measures. He reformed the calendar, introduced a new currency. He set up schools all over the empire, created a civil service exam. These reforms were necessary. China was vast, diverse, ruled by a single dynasty. The Han had to hold it together. How did he do it? Through Confucianism. You see, China had many philosophies, Taoism, legalism, Mohism, but Emperor Wu chose Confucianism. Its focus on ethics, family, and society suited his vision. He studied Confucian classics, appointed scholars to influential positions, laid the foundation of a Confucian bureaucracy. The result was stability. Now, let's look at the second part of his empire, the expansionist phase. Remember, Wudi wanted more than power. He wanted legacy. He wanted to be remembered. So he launched the Xi'an campaign, a series of military campaigns in what is today Vietnam and parts of Southeast Asia. His goal was simple: stop the raids along the southern border. He achieved his goal, but that wasn't enough. He wanted to control the South China Sea, defeat the Xiongnu once and for all, finish the job his father started. His General Li Guangli, helped him do it. Together, they destroyed the kingdom of Nam Viet and established the protectorate of Jiaozi, what is today northern Vietnam. The victories were important, but so was the timing. China was growing powerful, confident, and Emperor Wu wanted to show that power to the rest of the world. That's when he sent an envoy to the King of Korea with a message. If you don't pay tribute to China, we will consider it an act of hostility. The same message went to Japan, to the kingdoms of the Malay Peninsula. Tribute missions became an annual affair. Kings from across Asia came to pay homage to the Dragon Emperor. They brought with them rare animals, exotic plants, precious metals, and stones, all for the privilege of doing business with China. But this policy had its critics. Some said it was a waste of money. Others said it encouraged decadence at home. But Emperor Wu ignored them. He kept looking west. He wanted to reach the end of the Silk Road. And for that, he needed allies. Enter the Xiongnu. The same Xiongnu whom he defeated on the battlefield. Now he was inviting them to join the Han, and this is what happened next. The Xiongnu cavalry joined the Han army. They defeated the king of the western regions and took control of Central Asia. With that, the Silk Road became safer. Trade increased. Cities along the route flourished. The economy grew. China was entering a golden age, but it did not last. In 100 BC, Emperor Wu died. His empire was vast, richer than any before it, stable thanks to Confucianism. It was an empire on the rise, ready to become a superpower. But we know how history works. Success is never smooth. After Wudi came his grandson, Wang Mang. He tried to reform the empire, failed, and soon China descended into civil war. But that's a story for another day. Why? Because today we celebrate the dragon of the Silk Road, the man who showed China the path of greatness. You see, China's growth did not happen overnight. It was the cumulative effort of several rulers, several dynasties. Wudi was one of them. He built a strong central government. He standardized weights and measures, reformed the calendar. He chose Confucianism as the state philosophy, improved agriculture and trade. He expanded the empire to its greatest size. He ruled like a god, and that's why we call him the martial emperor. He changed the course of Chinese history forever. He made the Silk Road the lifeline of his empire. He traded, not just goods, but also ideas, culture, religion, technology. He opened China to the world. And that's why we call him the Dragon of the Silk Road. That's all from the show today. If you enjoyed this episode, do share it with your friends and family. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to get notified every time we upload a new video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. He ruled like a god over his people, feared and respected, even worshipped by those he ruled. But when the strangers came to his magnificent capital city, he welcomed them as friends only to have his own people turn on him and his empire burned to the ground. This is the story of Montezuma, the last emperor of the Aztecs. The year was 1519 and the Aztec Empire, also known as the Mexica, was at its peak. It covered much of what is now central Mexico and consisted of hundreds of city-states that were united under one banner. The capital, Tenochtitlan, was a magnificent city of gold that floated on the lake. In fact, the Aztecs were considered the lords of the lake. Their temples seemed to touch the sky, and their warriors were some of the most feared in the world. And then there was Montezuma II, the emperor of the Aztecs, the ruler of this magnificent city. He was considered a god by his people. His name literally meant destroyer of the moon. When he walked through the streets of Tenochtitlan, people would fall to their knees and bow down before him. They believed he was the incarnation of the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of knowledge and wind. And Montezuma himself did little to dispel this myth. He dressed in fine clothes, wore jewelry made of precious stones, and lived in a palace made of gold and precious woods. He had everything he could possibly want or need. So, Why, when the strangers arrived, would he invite them into his home and doom his empire in the process? To understand why Montezuma did what he did, we must first take a closer look at the strangers themselves. They were a small group of men led by a conquistador named Hernán Cortés. No more than 600 strong, they arrived in the port of Veracruz in 1519. What they lacked in numbers, however, they made up for in technology and ferocity. The Aztec chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún wrote of the Spaniards. Among them were some men of large stature, bearded, with faces and bodies well proportioned. They wore clothing of fine texture, silk stockings, and soft leather shoes. Weapons were not lacking to them. They carried helmets of metal, quivers full of arrows and guns. The Aztecs had never seen anything like it. When Montezuma heard about the foreigners who had landed on the coast, he sent a delegation out to meet them. The first time Montezuma saw Cortés and his men, he thought they were the gods who had come to take him back to the underworld. You see, the Aztecs believed that their gods had warned them that one day the gods would return to claim the tribute that was owed them. And when Montezuma saw these men with their white skin and beards, he thought this was it. That's why he greeted them so warmly. In fact, when Cortés extended his hand to Montezuma in greeting, Montezuma bowed down and kissed his hand. The two leaders couldn't have been more different. Cortés was a ruthless conquistador who was only interested in one thing, gold. Montezuma was a scholarly man who loved his books and his art. Cortés spoke broken Nahuatl, the Aztec language. Montezuma understood some of it, but he preferred to speak in the classical Nahuatl. Yet despite their differences, Montezuma decided to welcome the Spaniards into his. On November 8, 1519, Cortés and his men entered Tenochtitlan. They were met with a sight that took their breath away. The city was magnificent. It was a place unlike any they had ever seen before. They marveled at the great temples, the bustling markets, and the sheer number of people. Tenochtitlan was the largest city in the Western Hemisphere and perhaps the most densely populated place on Earth. Its population has been estimated to be anywhere from 300,000 to 400,000, making it larger than London, Paris, and Rome at the time. The Aztecs had created this city from a small village, and they had done it in less than 200 years. That was something the Spaniards had to admit was impressive. Still, Cortés wasn't fooled by all this opulence. He knew that behind all the gold and jewels, there was a dark side to the city, a side that was built on human sacrifice. The Aztecs were notorious for their practice of human sacrifice. They believed that in order to keep the world in balance, the gods needed blood. And where better to get blood than from the neighboring tribes that they conquered? According to the Spanish, over 20,000 people were sacrificed in Tenochtitlan every year. Despite this, Montezuma welcomed the Spaniards and treated them like honored guests. He gave them gifts of gold and jewels and threw feasts for them. He hoped that if the Spaniards saw how generous and hospitable he was, they would become his friends. And for a while, it seemed to be working. Cortés and his men marveled at all the wonders of Tenochtitlan, and they enjoyed the fine clothes and food that Montezuma gave them. But as the weeks went on, Cortés became more and more suspicious of Montezuma. He began to think that the emperor was hiding something from him. Why, for example, were there so many guards around the palace? And why did Montezuma seem so nervous all the time? Cortés didn't know it, but Montezuma was worried that his empire was in danger. You see, the Aztecs had been fighting a long and bloody war with the neighboring tribes. And now that the Spaniards had arrived, Montezuma was afraid they would get involved. He was right. Begun by Cortés' second-in-command, Francisco Hernandez, the skirmishes between the Spaniards and Aztecs started off small. Just a few stolen chickens here, an argument over a woman there. But they quickly escalated into full-blown battles. In one particularly vicious fight, a Spaniard was killed. This outraged Montezuma, who ordered the killer to be put to death. But the Aztecs refused to give up the killer. This was too much for Cortés, who saw it as a direct insult to him. He and his men prepared for war. On May 1520, Cortés and his men marched on the Aztec capital. They were met with fierce resistance, but they were too strong for the Aztecs. The Spaniards fought with swords and guns. the Aztecs with clubs and arrows. In the end, the Aztecs were defeated. Cortés had Montezuma arrested and taken to the main square, where he forced him to watch as his soldiers looted the city. The next day, Cortés and his men left Tenochtitlan. They had taken with them the riches of the Aztec Empire and Montezuma's life. The Spaniards had won the battle, but the war was far from over. In the coming months, the Spanish would lay siege to the city, cutting off its supply of food and water. As the Aztecs starved, they grew weaker and more desperate. In June 1521, the Spanish launched a final assault on the city. The Aztec emperor watched as his empire fell apart. His warriors were defeated and his people were being slaughtered. On August 13, 1521, Tenochtitlan fell. In the end, the Aztecs lost more than 100,000 people, half of them killed by the Spanish sword and the other half dying from diseases brought over by the conquistadors. Montezuma died in 1520, along with his empire, the last emperor of the Aztecs. The ruler of a once great empire reduced to nothing more than a memory. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, Cortés kept Montezuma's head as a trophy and hung it from the crossbar of the Church of Santo Domingo in Mexico City. In 1822, Mexican revolutionaries cut the head off the statue of the Spanish viceroy and paraded it through the streets of the city, chanting, "Long live Mexico." Later, the remains of the Aztec emperor were returned to his place of birth and reburied with full honors. Today, the ruins of Tenochtitlan are all that remain of the once great Aztec empire. But Montezuma's story lives on in the hearts and minds of the Mexican people. He's a symbol of their culture and heritage, a reminder of the greatness that once was and can be again. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss an upload. Thank you, and until next time. This is the leader who will unite the Mongols. Born into obscurity. No, not that guy. That's a long way down. This is a tale of one man's rise from nobody to the most feared conqueror in history, of how a hungry boy became a ruthless killer. A forgotten outcast became the ruler of the biggest empire the world had ever seen. This is the story of Genghis Khan, the storm from the steppe. Our story begins many years before Genghis Khan was even born. For centuries, there had been peace in the Mongolian steppe. No wars, no famine, just a never-ending cycle of feast and fun. The Mongolians lived off their cattle and sheep, feasting on their meat and drinking their kumis. Their days consisted of herding animals, wrestling matches, and horse races. Their nights were filled with music, dancing, and drinking. It was a good life. But then everything changed because in 1162, a war broke out between two of the nomadic tribes in the region. It was a big deal because these tribes were sworn enemies. It was personal. Each side blamed the other for stealing their women and killing their brothers. The fighting was brutal, but it wasn't very effective either. Neither side could defeat the other, so they started targeting each other's villages. Soon, entire clans were wiped out. Women and children taken hostage and roasted alive. Brothers killed by the dozens. The whole region descended into chaos. In the middle of this bloodbath, somewhere deep in the Mongolian steppe, a baby was born. His father was a chieftain named Yasuge, who led one of the smaller Mongol tribes. They weren't strong enough to fight in the war, so they kept their heads down and hoped things would settle soon. But they were wrong. When Yasuge's son was born, he didn't cry like babies normally do. Instead, he looked up at the sky and screamed at the top of his lungs. The old wives in the village said this kid was cursed. Some said he'd bring great honor to the clan. But everyone agreed on one thing: he shouldn't be called Temujin, which means iron. A name like that brought bad luck. Instead, he should be called Genghis, meaning ocean. Hopefully, that would wash away his bad fortune. And so Genghis grew up in a chaotic world. When he was 9 years old, his father was poisoned by rivals. His mother took him and his siblings, fleeing for their lives through the endless grasslands. They were hunted by men who stabbed sleeping parents in front of their children and roasted entire clans over open fires. One night, while making camp, Genghis and his mother were captured by rival nomads. She was forced to marry one of the kidnappers, but she told Genghis and his brother to run away. "Don't look back," she cried. "Don't look back no matter what." But Genghis couldn't help himself. He turned around and saw his mom being dragged away. In that moment, he vowed revenge. He returned home and rallied his father's allies. Together, they tracked down his mother's kidnapper and stormed his camp. They found his mom, but she was already dead. To pay tribute to her, Chingy cut off the head of the man who had taken her away and threw it into his funeral pyre. Then he returned to his tribe and vowed to unite the Mongols under his rule or die trying. Genghis was smart. He knew his small tribe alone stood no chance against the others. First, he needed allies. He started by visiting a powerful tribe just a few miles away. At the time, they were neutral in the war, but after hearing Chinggis' plan, they joined him. Next, he visited an old rival of his father. This chieftain hated Yasuge, but he liked Chinggis. He welcomed the young leader with open arms, and soon the third tribe joined them too. Now, Chinggis had 30,000 men to call his own. His first order of business: find and punish the man responsible for poisoning his father. Once again, he assembled his army and rode deep into enemy territory. After weeks of fighting, he finally tracked his father's poisoner to a fortress in the mountains. There, surrounded by his allies, Chinggis laid siege to the castle. Day after day, he rained arrows down on the fortress walls until the supply wagons inside ran out of food. Then he gave the order to attack. His men swarmed the fortress, hacked the gate off its hinges, and stormed inside. They slaughtered every single person in that castle, turning it into a tomb. And the whole thing only took 3 hours. As the bodies piled up, Chinggis stood on the fortress wall, surveying the carnage below. He was only 24 years old. As news of his victory spread across the steppe, more and more Mongol tribes pledged loyalty to him. By the end of the year, he had united the Mongols under his banner. All of them followed one simple rule: obey or die. Now that he was the leader of all the Mongols, Chinggis set his sights on the riches of China. He led his horde across the Gobi Desert, defeated the armies of the Quraysh Empire, and planted his flag atop the Great Wall of China. He continued his campaign into Korea, defeating armies along the way. He even fought his own relatives who switched sides. But still, none of the Chinese generals could stop him. Soon, he set his eyes on the most heavily fortified city in the world, Xiangyang. It was considered impregnable, but after 6 months of battering its walls, Chinggis finally captured it. Its streets ran red with blood. Men, women, and children were put to death. Only a handful of civilians were spared, but they would never forget what Chinggis did their city. After plundering China, Chinggis returned home. He consolidated his power, reorganized his army, and set his sights on the Middle East. Between 1219 and 1220, he conquered Khwarezmia, one of the richest cities in the world. He looted its bazaars and palaces, collected its gold and silver, and left the rest in smoldering ruins. From there, he marched west, sweeping aside any kingdom that opposed him. He battled fierce warriors, towering giants, and dark sorcerers. He even tamed an island full of demons. Okay, maybe not that last one. But that's exactly what Genghis Khan's followers claimed he did. Because back in those days, conquering new lands meant doing battle with mythical beasts. And what better way to prove your strength than by taming a fire-breathing demon island? As his empire grew, Chinggis changed. At first, he was known as the Scourge of God. He delighted in terrorizing people. He slaughtered everyone in his path. Whole cities turned into tombs. He even killed songbirds just for fun. But as time went on, he became more sophisticated. He assembled a huge library in his capital. He protected merchants on their trade routes and allowed people to practice any religion they wanted. He wasn't perfect, but compared to other leaders at the time, he was practically a saint. In 1227, Chinggis died of an arrow wound. Legend says he fell off a horse while hunting, but really he was probably shot by an enemy archer. Either way, he spent his last days planning more conquests. He dreamed of uniting the whole world under his rule, but he never got the chance. When he died, his empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. It was the largest land empire in history. Genghis Khan changed the course of history. He unified the Mongol tribes, created the largest empire the world had ever seen, and he crushed anyone who dared defy him. He was ruthless, cunning, brave, honorable, cultured, tolerant, and downright terrifying. He was the original bad boy, and we can't get enough. That's all for now. See you next time.